our very first Spring Boot application. Now, the Spring framework basically offers everything that you need to build complex Java applications. And in recent years, the Spring framework has gotten really complex. It offers application frameworks for web applications, accessing databases, security, and so on. Spring Boot is what makes it easy for you to get up and running with your Spring projects. So you'll find that when you use Spring Boot for your Spring projects, it's almost like magic. You're up and running in no time at all. And you'll see this magic begin in the pom.xml file. When you work with Spring Boot, it's best to use a dependency management system such as Apache Maven or Gradle. Other systems also work, but these are the most common ones and they're well tested and will work for you almost out of the box. Here is what the default POM looks like generated by my Maven starter project. I'm going to update this to include Spring Boot dependencies. The first thing that you ought to observe here is that I have a parent tag on lines 5 through 10 which specifies the Spring Boot starter parent, and there is a version number 2.3.1.release that is associated with this Spring Boot starter. The whole idea of including this starter parent dependency is that it provides sensible defaults for all of our Spring Boot dependencies and any configuration that we specify. Specifying this within the parent tag indicates to Maven that we want to accept all of the dependencies available by default in this starter parent. When you use the Spring Boot starter parent, you only need to specify the version number for your parent dependency. It happens to be 2.3.1, the latest version at the time of this recording. You don't need to specify specific versions for all of your other Spring dependencies. All of the other Spring modules that you'll work with, that you'll depend on, will simply get the right version from this starter parent. So you don't have to worry about the versions of individual modules, which is a great load off your mind. Once you've inherited from the Spring Boot starter parent for sensible defaults, another key feature of using Spring Boot for your application is the use of starter dependency descriptors. And the dependency descriptor that we've defined here is the Spring Boot starter on line 28. Starter dependency descriptors are what makes Spring Boot so easy to work with. Instead of manually specifying the dependencies for your application, you simply specify the starter descriptor for the kind of application that you want to build. For a very basic Spring application where you depend on only the core Spring modules, this starter, Spring Boot starter, is sufficient. You'll use different starters for different kinds of applications. For example, there is a web starter for web applications using Spring MVC. There is a JPA starter if you want to use an object relational mapping model to work with your relational database. When you use these starters, you're working with production ready, tested, and supported dependency configurations. You don't have to worry about version management of individual Spring modules. Everything will just work. Another thing to note here before we move on from this pom.xml file is on line 14. Notice that our application is built as a jar. That is, it is a self-contained Java application. You don't have to explicitly deploy the application somewhere for it to run. Spring will just work. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our app.java code and write our very first Spring Boot application here. I'm going to get rid of the code that has been generated by default here and set up my Spring code. Now the first thing that ought to jump out at you is the 3 annotations that we have specified on this app class. Each of the annotations that we've specified here on lines 8, 9 and 10 has its own role to play. And it's important that you understand what each annotation does because these form the core of the Spring Boot framework. The first of these annotations here is the @Spring Boot configuration. This is a class level annotation that is part of the Spring Boot framework and it indicates that a class provides application configuration. Now in Spring Boot, you'll typically use Java annotation based configuration specification rather than XML files. As a result, this @Spring Boot configuration annotation is the primary source for configuration within your applications. Generally, you'll apply this annotation to the class which contains the main method, the entry point for your Spring Boot application. The use of this annotation in the class that is your entry point allows configuration to be automatically located. So that's where this is typically used. The next annotation that we've applied here is the at enable auto configuration. Now, Spring Boot frees you up from dependency management. Once you specified the starter descriptors within your pom.xml, all of the dependencies that are part of those starter descriptors are automatically available in your Java class path. Now, when you apply this at enable auto configuration annotation to your Spring Boot app, this auto configures the beans present in the Java class path. Any dependency available in the class path of your application, set up using your starter descriptors, will be injectable automatically as a bean within your app, and you can reference those libraries in a very straightforward manner without jumping through hoops. Auto configuration does a lot of magic behind the scenes by guessing the beans that you require. For example, if you have the Tomcat embedded jar in your class path, then you will need a Tomcat embedded servlet container factory bean to configure the Tomcat server. This will be injected automatically. This is done without you having to specify any specific XML based or Java based configuration. And finally, we come to the third annotation here, the at component scan. This basically tells Spring Boot that you need to scan the current package, which in our case is com.skillsoft.springboot, and all of the sub packages